Hey everyone, welcome to today's video. Today I decided I'd answer a little bit of a question that I had to myself. See, every time someone mentions a Hellcat or really a Challenger, there's always that one person like, it's a big boat, can't turn. And no one would ever imagine that anyone would want to road race a Challenger. But then you have people like Wesley Motorsports who road races a Challenger RT Scat Pack and a Hellcat Red Eye wide body, and to pretty great effect at that, including at Pikes Peak. So in the spirit of that, I was like, well, if Wesley Motorsports can do that with their Challenger, I wonder if I could take a 2015 Dodge Challenger SRT Hellcat and Horizon 4 and make it competitive in an S1 online lobby. Now, by competitive, I mean at least top 5 and above. I don't really expect to win because ultimately you just don't have the modern suspension, it's still too heavy, so on and so forth. But if I could get within at least top 5, then that's pretty good going. So coming up is me building the car and then tuning the car and then some races. I'll see you all during the build. So what did I do for upgrades then? Well, initially, my whole goal was to make a purely handling-focused car, a lot like my S1900 Viper TA replica car. The Hellcat has 707 horsepower and 650 pound-feet of torque, but only has 275 section tires. So obviously, and rather infamously, the Hellcat has traction problems that would need to be resolved first. Annoyingly, I couldn't go for the one option that would have given me the best chance of solving the Challenger's tire woes, though. The Liberty Walk wide-body kit that I was pining for at the beginning of this build removes the option for a front splitter. Annoying, because, outside of increased tire widths, I was banking on the presence of a splitter to reduce the understeer of the Hellcat. Unlike the Viper, which has its front engine far enough behind the front axle to be called a front mid-engine car, the Challenger 6.2-liter supercharged V8 is pretty much on top of the front axle. This means that, while the weight distribution itself isn't actually the worst ever, there is more weight on the nose and axle of the car than is ideal for track driving, which means you're very likely to encounter some understeer. Again, as a way of combating this, I was hoping to get the splitter along with the wide-body kit. With those dreams dashed, though, I decided that having some aerodynamic weight on the front end for mid to high-speed corners was a little more important than getting some slightly bigger rubber. As it turns out, this might have been a good call. For the front, I could get some Viper-sized 295 section front tires and some not-so-Viper-sized 335 section rear tires, all with the narrow body. Not only that, but I could increase the track width at both ends, which also gave me some handling benefits. As I said at the beginning, my initial goal was to make a purely handling-focused car. I wasn't going to touch the power because the Hellcat doesn't really need more power. Its old suspension and high power output made it clear in my mind that all I would need to do was put some racing springs on the car and take as much weight out as possible, among other things. As I would come to find out, though, I wouldn't be able to make a purely handling-focused Challenger that would also make it to the top of S1 class, S1900 for those who don't know. I did all the normal race upgrades and even went for one of the lightest wheels in the game, but to no avail. Some of you might be saying, why wouldn't you just leave the power then? And the simple answer is that I simply wouldn't be as competitive without doing all the upgrades I could for the class. With that in mind, reluctantly, I went to the engine menu and started adding power. Surprisingly, I had more than enough PI left to do almost everything. I did the air filter, the fuel system, the ignition, the exhaust, a must for power and weight reduction, the flywheel, the compression/pistons, the valves, and even the camshafts. The result? About 880 horsepower and somewhere above 750 pound-feet of torque. Way more power than I wanted, especially considering this car's less than ideal suspension for proper competitive track driving. Oh, and the weight. I did manage to get the car down to 3,400-ish pounds. I think it was like 3,414, which isn't too bad all things considered, but I still feared the big coupe would be too heavy to make it within the top 5. However, I did have one last ace up my sleeve for making the Challenger Hellcat as competitive as possible. Tuning. For those of you who want one of the best guides for tuning I found for Forza, check out this video from Hoki Hoshi. I tune all my cars with this method now, and all of them are just awesome to drive on the roads of Horizon 4. Gushing aside, I now had to, yet again, bank on this method to turn the Challenger into a weapon for the track, however effective. So, we got all the tuning done. In fact, let me walk you through the settings here. So, we didn't change the tire pressure, we didn't change the gearing. I changed the alignment because the alignment was -2 degrees camber in the front, and 1.5 in the rear, so that's way too much. So we went with the normal Gen 5 SRT GT GTS alignment, which is 1.4 degrees of negative camber in the front and 1.1 in the rear. We did a little bit of toe out to increase turn in at the front, but no, we did a positive, yeah, and then we did a little bit of toe in at the rear to aid stability, and then the front caster is 6 degrees. The anti-roll bars, the setting is 35.50, and then the rear is 30.40 because the car, the weight distribution is 54% in the front and 46% in the rear, so that's why we have that. The front springs, we have 1,116.7 pounds per square inch, I guess, and then 1,003.2 pounds per square inch at the back. I tried to let's increase the rate just a little bit there, actually. So the front is, I guess it's actually higher than the rear, which is a little unfortunate, but we're at 4.5 inches in the front and 4.1 inches at the rear. The damping, we're at 12.2. The setting is 12.2 in the front, 10.8 in the rear. For the bump stiffness, which is anywhere between 50 and 70% of the rebound stiffness, we're at 7.3 in the front and 6.5 in the rear. Aero, I wanted more, as you probably... Actually, no, I didn't show that. I wanted a little bit more rear aero stability. Actually, I may have shown this, but anyway, I wanted more rear aero stability because a lot of power, and then a little bit less downforce. So I kept them within 200 pounds of each other. Didn't change the brake, and I did change the differential, so it doesn't lock as aggressively now. I did that to reduce understeer. So we're at 62% of acceleration for lock and 30% deceleration. So that's what we've got. Then the time came to put the Challenger to the test and see if it really could be made into something competitive enough for consistent top 5 finishes. I must confess, my first few stints with the big coupe weren't exactly the last word in racing perfection. I had been driving my S1 Viper a lot beforehand, so getting used to a car that was significantly heavier and had worse dynamics wasn't something I accounted for before jumping into the online lobbies. However, once I settled in and got used to the Challenger's different characteristics, I started doing strangely good. The weight was still there, but it was tolerable. I finally wasn't the slowest car in a straight line thanks to the monstrous power, the brakes were much better than expected, and the grip was a vast improvement over stock. Wheel spin was still a concern, but as long as you rolled onto the throttle at the appropriate time, with the appropriate care, you can get out of the corners way better than before. It wasn't all good news, though. Like I said before, the Challenger had a weird tendency to undulate unnervingly through some corners, as if the damping wasn't stiff enough and there wasn't enough suspension travel to cope with that. It still felt a bit heavy for the class, and despite the power output, it still wasn't the fastest car on the grid. With all that in mind, were all the upgrades and half hour I spent on tuning enough to make the Challenger properly competitive in S1 class? Yes. Let me be fair about things for a second though. We all know that Forza online lobbies aren't the pinnacle of driving excellence, as I demonstrated perfectly in my first few races. Doing well in lobbies like this aren't the end-all be-all of whether you or your car are any good, despite the presence of a few tryhards. I wasn't looking or expecting to win. All I wanted was to be in the top 5. If I could be in the top 5 whilst being in a near full field whilst also dealing with tryhards, then I would know whether or not this build was any good. And so that came to be. While not the first track I went to, the Bamberg Coast Circuit would prove to be one of the most educational tracks I went to during the multiplayer rotation. With a combination of slow corners, fast sweepers, and long mid-speed corners, this track was a great place to see what the Challenger was made of. And so it turned out to be. Turn 1 proved that the Challenger had far less understeer problems than I feared it might, yes, even with the splitter. The double left-hander also proved to be no match for the mighty Challenger. The next left-hander before the long right sweeper, a corner I fear because of its tightness, also didn't dampen the Challenger's stride. I did have to be wary of my throttle input so I didn't just obliterate the tires, but provided I could be careful, the Challenger was once again proving itself to be an enjoyable car on the track. However, there was one section of the track I didn't realize would bring the big coupe to its knees. The left-right, left-left chicane just before the main straight. Perhaps foolishly, although in hindsight obviously foolishly, I thought I had solved all of the Challenger's cornering problems based on my experience with the previous turns. So when I came to the big braking zone for the slow set of corners, I was lulled into the sense of comfort that I'd be able to take the corner with more speed than I might have initially expected. I should have heeded that initial expectation. The moment I got halfway through the corner, I realized the Challenger was not going to play ball. The Challenger was oddly riddled with understeer, and the only way to fix it was to essentially pedal my way through the corner like it was a Flintstone car. A massive disadvantage when there are multiple cars in the race that are far lighter and can carry much greater corner speed through this section, thus immediately putting them back on my bumper. I thought that maybe I just overdrove the car or had a bad line, so on the second lap I tried again, waiting to see if this was just driver error on my part or if the car really didn't like the corner. Sure enough, the same problem persisted. It wasn't just me. The Challenger just really does not like slow, tight corners. No matter how I tried to take the corner, I just could not get a flow that I was satisfied with. Annoying, but without massive suspension, weight, and dynamics changes, it's probably a miracle I even managed to get this far with the Hellcat. So what are my overall thoughts then, right? Well, the first proper race with the Challenger Hellcat ACR turned out way better than I was expecting. For the most part, I reduced the understeer to largely tolerable levels, and it now had significantly more grip than ever before. Enough grip to give the other cars I was racing a real fright. I even managed to finish 5th and 4th on 2 separate occasions at this track. The first time with 11 people on track, and the second time with 10 people on track. So far then, so good. The next track we went to was the Prince's Street Garden Circuit. Oh dear, a track with mostly slow corners. The Prince's Street Garden Circuit was a track I honestly thought I'd really struggle at. Turn 1 is a tight corner, so understeer and oversteer could have been a problem. Turn 2 was tight and threatened oversteer because of its geometry. The double right-hander at the end of the uphill section is also tight and slow, and the first right-hand corner at the end of the downhill S's is also tight and slow. Not what you would call an ideal situation by any means whatsoever. Thing is, the big boat actually did surprisingly well. I'm not going to say it was the most comfortable race I've ever had around the street circuit. It really wasn't. But the muscle yacht put its best foot forward and put in a very respectable showing despite the weight and dynamics penalty. Even still, the left-hander after turn 1 proved to be tricky, and like the last section at Bamborough, the Challenger hated life through the double right-hander with every fiber of its being. Everywhere else, the Challenger could just about tolerate, even the first of the double S's, though only barely. Ironically, I wasn't the one struggling the most in the corners though. As I said at the beginning, I was gunning for the likes of the Mustang GT350R and the Camaro ZL1 1LE, or a ZL1 with Forza Aero, and as it happened, someone finally brought a 6th gen Camaro with Forza bits for me to race against. Once I caught up to them, I found out that I was much faster than them through the turns. We were pretty equal on the straights though. A good part of that was due to their poor racing lines, but I had a pretty clear advantage that I think I could press home even if they got their lines right. Overall then, while not as enjoyable to drive as it was at the Bamborough Coast Circuit, the Hellcat ACR did far better than I was expecting given the tightness and slowness of the majority of the track. Even more importantly, I got to find a car I was benchmarking and proved my Challenger could keep up. In short, you can race the Challenger Hellcat at this track, but take extra care to get the car turned for those slow corners. And finally, let's talk about a sprint race, specifically the Lake District Sprint. Apparently, I didn't do that many of them, and few were well populated, so this one will have to do. Still, this one isn't completely full of tight corners, nor is it just a straight line snooze fest, so let's get to analyzing. The first big sweeper at turn 1, as you would expect, was handled very well by the Challenger. It wasn't my best start, so there seemed to be a bit of understeer midway through the corner, but it was largely good news at this corner. The north right-hand entrance at Ambleside brought more good news, though with slightly more significant notes than the big left-hand sweeper. This corner seems to decrease its radius slightly near the exit, so it's easy to think you're understeering when really you're just running out of room. But that said, I did run a little wide on the exit and hit a portion of the cobblestone wall. The right-hander and left-hander at the little bridge in the beautiful but tight city of Ambleside always gets me worried. I somehow tend to mess it up going the opposite direction when in free roam, so I felt that I had to be extra careful not to screw it up in the race. I almost screwed it up before I even made it to the corner though. I got a bit of a slide on during the left-hander before the bridge, and that put me on the outside at the exit of the left-hander, but then put me on a far too shallow line going into the entrance of the right-hander for the bridge. Despite that immediate screw-up, I thankfully got the big boat slowed down enough to take the corner without any other mistakes being made and without costing me even more time. The rest of the race went on without other hiccups, and I came in 6th. One place behind where I wanted to be, but still a pretty good result, especially considering all the scruffiness that went on. So what did I find out when I made a wide-body version of the Challenger? Well, little that I liked, and one very big thing that I definitely didn't like. Let's begin by getting the hard facts out of the way first though. Obviously, the appeal of going this route with your Challenger build is the fact that you can get bigger rubber, and indeed I was able to get some real meaty tires on my car. A whopping 335s on the front, and definitely Viper-sized 355s on the rear. Everywhere else, the two Challengers are nearly identical. It has nearly the exact same horsepower, 898 horsepower and 778 pound-feet of torque, compared to 883 horsepower and 764 pound-feet of torque. It weighs nearly the same, 3,502 pounds instead of 3,409 pounds, and the weight distribution is exactly the same at 54% to the front and 45% to the rear. The two drove the same as well. The straight line advantage I talked about earlier was noticeably but minimally amplified thanks to the lack of a splitter. Turn-in was slightly better in some slow and medium speed corners, but high-speed understeer was noticeably increased thanks to the lack of the splitter. Exactly what I feared going this route. What makes this car complicated is the simple fact that the lack of a splitter increased the aforementioned high-speed understeer, and I hate high-speed understeer. This meant that I actually prefer driving the narrow-body, slimmer-tired Challenger than the splitterless, thicker-tired wide-body Chally. It felt more balanced. The wide-body kind of felt like it had less rear-end grip because the overall downforce levels were down, a bit more stable, and could, obviously, carry more corner speed in the corners I aimed to make the Challenger good at. Despite that, I managed to get more 4th and 3rd place finishes than I remember getting with the narrow-body Challenger, even though I preferred that car. Obviously, this meant that a hot lap comparison was in order. I decided I would go to 2 tracks and run approximately 10 laps in each car, a little more if I felt like all the prior laps were crap. The first track I went to was the good old Bamborough Coast circuit, and the second track was actually the Lakehurst Cop circuit. The idea behind these 2 tracks was that I go to a track that might favor the wide body, the last section at Bamborough specifically, and then go to a track that might favor the narrow body. Lakehurst has a lot of understeer-inducing high-speed corners, just to see how big the differences would be at their logical extremes. And so the first track we start at is the good old Bamborough Coast circuit. After running both versions of the Challenger at Bamborough first, I got some interesting results. The upshot is this. The wide body managed to be a fraction faster than the narrow body, but only thanks to a costly bit of overdriving on my part. The lap times even reflect how infuriatingly close the two builds are, with the narrow body turning in a lap time of 52.352 seconds and the wide body turning in a lap time of 52.286 seconds, easily within driver error. That result is slightly puzzling, considering the narrow body was faster through the entirety of Turn 1, thanks to the splitter, Turn 3, thanks again to the splitter, the entrance of Turn 4, not the exit, where my excessive speed in the beginning cost me, Turn 5, thanks again to the splitter, and the first and second left-hander at the last section. Nevertheless, the end result was surprisingly close, and I imagine that if I didn't mess up the exit of Turn 4, the narrow body might have been slightly faster, though once again, the differences would have been within driver error. For Lakehurst, the story is exactly the same here as well. The narrow body and wide body were only separated by tenths. My best time in the narrow body was a 1 minute .960, and my best time in the wide body was a 1 minute .928. Once again within driver error! Turn 7, the fast left-hand sweeper lined with rocks on the right side of the exit, was the first place where I experienced the biggest difference between the two builds. The narrow body was far more confident here and can take noticeably more corner speed because it has, say it with me, a splitter! I could carry more momentum through the turn and scrub off speed through the duration of the corner. The wide body, on the other hand, needed to brake, like at Bamborough, to the appropriate speed before I could turn in. That's why the narrow body has a higher corner entry speed than the wide body, but the same exit speed. The second place where I experienced a noticeable difference was at the last right-hander before the chicane, just behind the start-finish line. While the trap speeds don't reflect a big difference, the narrow body felt far less understeery and much more confident. My takeaway with all that in mind is this. Maybe you'll like driving the wide body more than I did. Maybe you'll find that it suits your driving style a little more, or perhaps you'll enjoy having some more eager turn-in than if you built a narrow body road racing Challenger. But for me, that noticeable increase in high-speed understeer because of the lack of a splitter reduces the appeal of the wide body. It did feel a bit more nimble and in some corners more eager to turn in, again especially at the slow section at Bamborough where the narrow body struggled. But a lot of routes in Forza Horizon 4 have high-speed corners, and that's where I like to experience the least amount of understeer that I can. For me, the narrow body is the better build route to go. When all is said and done, you really can't go wrong with either though. No matter which route you take, you're going to be doing a lot better than I think most people would give a Challenger like this credit for. So, can you build an effective Challenger for road racing in Horizon 4? Absolutely, and it'll be unexpectedly good as well. Anyway though, that is it for this video. I hope you all enjoyed this very comprehensive video. I didn't expect to make it this in-depth and for it to take this long as far as me editing and recording all the stuff. If you enjoyed, then please like, comment, share, and if I earned it, subscribe, hitting the little notification bell, and then all notifications, that way you don't miss an upload. I'll see you all next time.